Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating piece of source material. We're looking at a theological sermon focused on Philippians chapter 1, verses 19 through 26. Now, this text tackles something we all care about, the universal human desire for joy. And whether you're a theology buff or just curious about ancient philosophical approaches to human suffering, you're in for a treat. We're going to unpack a framework that completely flips our modern understanding of happiness totally on its head.
You know, modern society usually tells us that increasing our joy means achieving more comfort. We're talking a surplus of wealth, a fully funded 401k, or maybe a super safe, gated community. We just naturally assume our joy goes up when those things go up. But the source material presents a radically different thesis. According to the sermon, the biblical standard suggests that God actually assigns suffering as a way to deepen and magnify a believer's joy. So instead of seeing suffering as this terrible interruption you have to escape, it's framed as a deliberate assignment.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll kick things off with the joy-suffering paradox. Then we'll explore 3 specific benefits, or wines, found in suffering: spiritual deliverance, activating prayer, and deepening intimacy. And finally, we'll wrap up with the ultimate dilemma in Section 5, to live as Christ.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the joy-suffering paradox. To really wrap our heads around this paradox, we have to look at a Scottish theologian from the 1600s named Samuel Rutherford. Because of his beliefs, Rutherford was actually exiled and thrown into a dark, miserable prison cell. But here's the crazy part. His letters from that time weren't bitter complaints at all. They were full of ecstatic joy. He wrote that God often takes his children into the deepest cellar to show them his choicest wines. The source uses this quote to argue that when believers are placed in really dark circumstances, the cellar, so to speak, they shouldn't immediately rush for the door to get back out into the sunshine. The darkness is actually where they're offered something they couldn't possibly taste anywhere else.
And this cellar metaphor, it maps perfectly onto the Apostle Paul's situation in the book of Philippians. The text describes Paul literally chained to Praetorian guards in a dark Roman prison. There's no air conditioning, no soft mattress, and to make matters worse, out in the streets, his rivals are actively trying to destroy his reputation. By every single worldly standard, Paul should be absolutely miserable. Yet, his bold response is, "I will rejoice." The sermon argues that Christian suffering doesn't suppress joy, it actually supercharges it.
That brings us to Section 2, Wine 1. Spiritual deliverance.
So what exactly does Paul mean when he says his imprisonment will turn out for his deliverance? Well, the text emphasizes it's not necessarily a physical escape. Paul wasn't writing to his friends begging them to go plead his legal case to a judge so he could get out of jail. He even openly acknowledges he might die in there. Instead, the deliverance he's savoring is a spiritual vindication. It's ultimate salvation in the eyes of God. It's an eternal rescue, rather than just a temporary change of scenery.
Now, the sermon actually bridges Paul's ancient Roman prison to the modern, everyday cellars we might find ourselves in. This could mean enduring a really brutal health battle, navigating a deeply strained relationship with a relative, or just the sheer exhaustion of caring for a special needs child. The source frames these very real, painful realities not as roadblocks to happiness, but as chalices. The argument here is that faithfully enduring these modern chains produces a profound spiritual deliverance that you simply cannot experience when everything in your life is perfectly easy.
And to back this up, the source points out something really interesting. When Paul talks about this deliverance, he's actually quoting the Septuagint version of the book of Job. Job is a famous biblical figure who lost absolutely everything. His wealth, his children, his health. His own wife literally told him to curse God and die. But Job faithfully declared, "I know that my Redeemer lives." Job was ultimately vindicated, and his joy was multiplied. Paul is drawing a direct parallel here, resting in the total confidence that his Redeemer lives too.
Moving on to Section 3, Wine 2. Activating prayer. The source makes a strong case that suffering is never ever meant to be handled in isolation. Let's walk through this cause and effect chain of community prayer. It starts with Step 1, the believer suffering. But Step 2 is absolutely crucial. They must actually share that struggle with their community. The speaker explicitly notes that when someone asks how you are, you can't just brush it off and say, "I'm fine." You have to reveal your chains. This honesty leads to Step 3, the community prays, which triggers Step 4, the Spirit empowering, and finally resulting in Step 5, deliverance. So suffering acts as the catalyst that activates the prayer life of the entire community.
Now, the source makes a very specific theological distinction here about where this power actually comes from: the Spirit of Jesus Christ. The servant emphasizes that it's not a situation where humans bring the prayer and God just brings the power, because then humans could take pride in their part of the equation. Instead, it's the divine power, the Spirit of Jesus Christ, that actively works in the believer's heart to even generate the prayer in the first place. This ensures that the ultimate glory goes entirely to the divine, not to human effort.
Next up is Section 4, Wine 3, Deepening Intimacy. This is presented as maybe the most profound benefit found in that dark cellar of suffering. So how exactly does suffering create intimacy? Well, the source compares this spiritual intimacy to the incredibly deep bonds forged between friends who survive really hard times together. When believers suffer, the text argues they are actually joined to Christ's own historical suffering. This shared hardship magnifies intimacy in a way comfort never ever could. And because they're clothed in this shared identity, it completely eliminates the fear of shame when facing ultimate judgment, which results in profound joy and adoration. It's a bond forged right in the fire.
And finally, we arrive at Section 5, to live as Christ.
We've reached the absolute apex of the source material's argument, captured in this incredibly famous verse from Philippians 1:21. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. According to the sermon, for a believer whose entire life is genuinely aimed at honoring and glorifying Jesus, death is not a tragedy at all. It's a legitimate victory. It means finally being in the presence of the one they treasure the most. This sets up a really fascinating dilemma. Paul is completely hard-pressed between two options here. On one hand, departing to be with Christ means ultimate personal happiness and immediate relief from his dark, miserable prison. Sounds pretty good, right? On the other hand, remaining in the flesh means staying in that painful cellar to perform fruitful labor for others. The explainer neutrally highlights Paul's radical selflessness in this moment. He actually prefers to delay his own ultimate reward and remain in suffering simply because it will secure the spiritual progress and joy of the Philippian community.
To put that radical selflessness into perspective, the sermon contrasts it with what we typically consider a successful life. You know the drill: getting good grades, landing a high-paying career, buying a nice house, and retiring early to sit on a beach somewhere. The provocative claim made by the source is that, while these are definitely good things, achieving all these earthly milestones is considered a completely wasted life if it lacks an eternal purpose. If it's not aimed at something greater, it simply won't endure.
The sermon concludes with a highly provocative thought exercise, and I want to pose it directly to you today. Fill in the blanks. If you say to live is following the rules, then to die is just escaping the system. If you say to live is comfort, then to die is a total tragedy. How you fill in these blanks reveals what your life is truly aimed at. Are you running from the cellar, or are you looking for the wine in the darkness? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Until next time, keep learning and keep exploring.